Resident Evil has always had a sense of mystery to it, right? But imagine this, in the shadowy space between the legendary horrors of Resident Evil 1 and the spine-chilling intensity of Resident Evil 2, there lies a forgotten nightmare. A secret chapter so terrifying Capcom never dared unleash it upon the world. That's right. Locked away in gaming folklore, whispers speak of an unreleased entry, a game that fans have spent decades chasing the clues and rumours surrounding it, building up a picture of what has been kept from us. Essentially, Resident Evil 2 was initially intended to be an entirely different game, and Capcom's original vision was darker, bloodier, and, depending on who you ask, even better. But despite months of development being put into this mysterious title, something went horribly wrong. At 40% completion, they scrapped everything, deleting an entire game from existence and starting over from scratch. This version of Resident Evil 2, now referred to as Resident Evil 1.5, was set to be the next evolution in survival horror. Instead, Capcom abandoned it completely, raising the valid question, what on earth happened? Why did they throw away nearly half a finished game, and what remains of this forbidden relic today? I am Lady Decade. Subscribe if you love weird gaming history, because this is the story of Resident Evil 1.5, the lost survival horror game you were never supposed to play.
Resident Evil.
If you're watching this video, chances are you love games like this, and what's better is that I can get you massive discounts of up to 90% on many of the games you love. Right now, you can grab Resident Evil 2 Remake Deluxe Edition for just $7.71, Resident Evil 3 Remake for $6.18, and Resident Evil 7 Biohazard Gold Edition for only $8.10. And that's just the start. Using my discount links, you can also get Resident Evil 0 HD Remaster for $2.17, Revelations for $1.75, and Revelations 2 Deluxe Edition for just $3.22. But wait, because there's actually even more. If you're after a classic survival horror, Alone in the Dark Anthology is just $1.22, while The Evil Within, The Evil Within 2, and Alien Isolation are all under $6 each. These are absolute steals, so follow my links below to grab them for next to nothing before these amazing deals disappear. Before Resident Evil 2 became the game we know today, as mentioned, Capcom once had an entirely different sequel in mind. Fans first got a glimpse of Resident Evil 1.5 in previews and magazine coverage around 1996 and early 1997, primarily through screenshots and early gameplay footage featured in gaming magazines such as Electronic Gaming Monthly and GameFan. At that time, players simply believed that they were looking at an early build of what would eventually become Resident Evil 2. It wasn't until Capcom dramatically delayed and reworked the game under director Hideki Kamiya and writer Noboru Sugimura, resulting in the drastically different Resident Evil 2 released in January 1998, that fans realised the original game they had been anticipating had effectively vanished. Once the final Resident Evil 2 hit shelves, fans quickly noted the significant differences, and the mythos surrounding the abandoned project rapidly grew, transforming Resident Evil 1.5 into one of gaming's most legendary lost titles. Originally planned as a direct follow-up to the OG Resident Evil from 1996, this version was shaping up to be a more grounded, brutal take on survival horror. Gone were the gothic aesthetics and intricate puzzles. Instead, Capcom aimed for a more realistic, action-driven experience set in the heart of a city falling apart. The biggest change, Claire Redfield didn't exist. Instead, the second protagonist was Elza Walker, a college student and motorcycle enthusiast who found herself trapped in Raccoon City when the outbreak struck. Unlike Claire, Elza had no personal ties to the events unfolding, no missing brother, no prior knowledge of stars, just an ordinary citizen fighting to survive. Meanwhile, Leon wasn't the fresh-faced rookie fans would come to know. He was a seasoned Raccoon City police officer, already well-trained in handling dangerous situations, so fans were clearly set to receive something different entirely. The setting also differed significantly. The Raccoon City Police Department wasn't a converted art museum, but a practical, modern police station, complete with offices, interrogation rooms, and industrial-style corridors. The shift in design reflected a more grounded tone, stripping away the mansion-like mystery of the final game in favour of a more direct, visceral struggle against the infected. This was clearly not the sequel we got. In fact, Resident Evil 1.5's RPD was also a larger, more explorable environment compared to what we got in Resident Evil 2. The original layout included an accessible rooftop, potentially allowing for new traversal mechanics or escape routes, as well as a parking garage which was later redesigned for the final game but was originally a much bigger area. These additional locations emphasised that the police station was supposed to look like a real-world facility rather than a stylised setting, but this direction was ultimately cut when Capcom restructured the game's pacing and design. As mentioned, Capcom's original intention for Resident Evil 2 leaned much further into the survival elements that the franchise had established. The game was less focused on puzzle solving and more about endurance, with visible damage to characters' clothing present as hits were taken, and protective vests could be equipped to increase durability. Rather than the traditional typewriters used to save progress, Resident Evil 1.5 was rumoured to use a computer terminal instead. Some reports suggest that typewriters still existed in the game, but early footage and leaks indicate that Capcom was experimenting with a more modernised save system. This change would have been another step towards making the game feel more grounded and practical, though it remains unclear how fully implemented it was before development was scrapped. The enemy lineup in Resident Evil 1.5 was vastly different. The game lacked lickers entirely, instead featuring man-spiders, human spider hybrids that crawled through ventilation shafts. Zombies were more aggressive, capable of climbing ledges, and came in a variety of body types, including fat zombies and crawling undead. This version of Resident Evil 2 leaned more towards overwhelming numbers than individually detailed creatures. On a technical level, Capcom aimed for larger hordes of zombies on screen, creating a greater sense of overwhelming danger. However, to accommodate this, character models were simplified, making the undead appear less detailed than in the final game. Building on differences, rather than the title containing traditional green herbs like what were used in the final game, Resident Evil 1.5 featured a medicine vial system for healing. Players would have been able to mix green, red and blue medicine vials, similar to the herb mixing system later seen in the franchise. This change was likely an attempt to make healing more streamlined and grounded further in realism, which seems like the direction they were once going for. From all of this, it seems that Capcom's Resident Evil 2 was intended to be a raw, unfiltered fight for survival in a more believable world, but despite how far along the game was, something wasn't working. And soon, everything would come crashing down. By late 1996, Resident Evil 1.5 was deep in development, but behind the scenes, Capcom was struggling. The game was functional and had many completed assets, but something just wasn't clicking. Instead of feeling like the next step forward, 1.5 was shaping up to be too similar to the first game, lacking the tension, atmosphere and cinematic appeal that had made Resident Evil a surprise hit. Shinji Mikami, the director of the original game, and Hideki Kamiya, who was overseeing the sequel, weren't impressed. The game felt stiff, uninspired and lacking impact. The RPD, while realistic, didn't have the eerie, oppressive atmosphere that defined the Spencer Mansion. The gameplay changes, while interesting on paper, weren't making enough of a difference to feel like a true evolution. Technical issues were also piling up, and progress was slow. As Capcom evaluated the project, they realised they were heading in the wrong direction. Instead of refining what they had, they made a drastic choice: scrap everything and start over. This meant that Capcom would choose to dramatically alter the direction of Resident Evil 2 due to internal dissatisfaction surrounding the game at the company. This was primarily driven by series producer Shinji Mikami and his team's belief that the original game failed to meet their high creative standards. Mikami felt that the prototype lacked suspense and narrative depth, critical elements that fans expected after the success of the original title. But there were more elements he was not a fan of either. Narrative weaknesses were another critical factor that prompted Capcom's shift. The original lead protagonist, Elsa Walker, was perceived by developers as insufficiently compelling, lacking a personal connection to the existing Resident Evil universe. Recognizing the potential of intertwining narratives and deepening the lore, Capcom introduced Claire Redfield, the sister of the original game's hero, Chris Redfield. This change anchored Resident Evil 2 more deeply into the franchise's established storylines, enhancing emotional investment from the players. Technical constraints also contributed significantly to the change. The ambitious ideas planned for Resident Evil 1.5, such as dynamic lighting, expansive environments, and enhanced enemy AI, proved to be quite challenging for the PlayStation hardware. Developers found themselves limited by the technology of the time, forcing them to reassess what was realistically achievable. These struggles prompted the team to reconsider their ambitious concepts and refocus on atmosphere and gameplay elements that better aligned with their technical capabilities. Ultimately, the intervention of professional scenario writer Noboru Sugimura was the tipping point. After reviewing the early build, Sugimura advised the team that their current story direction was fundamentally flawed and would likely disappoint audiences. His blunt critique inspired Capcom to abandon nearly 70 to 80% of their existing work, effectively restarting the project. So, at 40% completion, Resident Evil 1.5 was dead. Capcom would return to the drawing board, reimagining what Resident Evil should be from the ground up. It was a bold, risky decision, but one that would change the franchise forever. But what survived? What is Resident Evil 1.5's legacy? Despite being scrapped, Resident Evil 1.5 didn't completely disappear. While much of the game was lost, some ideas, characters, and design elements survived, either repurposed for Resident Evil 2 or influencing later entries in the franchise. One of the most notable carryovers was Marvin Branagh. In 1.5, he is a major supporting character, assisting Leon and Elsa throughout their journey. However, in the final version of Resident Evil 2, his role was drastically reduced, appearing only briefly as an injured officer before succumbing to the virus. The game's central antagonist, William Birkin, also underwent significant changes. While 1.5 featured a version of Birkin's transformation, it was more simplistic compared to what Capcom eventually created for Resident Evil 2. The idea of a mutating, ever-evolving boss, however, would become a key part of the franchise, influencing later enemies like Nemesis and the regenerating monstrosities of Resident Evil 4. Even the Raccoon City Police Department itself wasn't entirely erased. While 1.5 had a more grounded modern police station, some layout elements and room ideas were reworked into the Resident Evil 2 we know today. Of course, instead of keeping the standard police station aesthetic, Capcom decided to return it to a converted art museum, adding a level of mystery and unease that the original setting lacked. Though Resident Evil 1.5 never saw an official release, its DNA still runs through the series. Some of its ideas and unused assets would later resurface in Resident Evil Outbreak, the Resident Evil 2 remake, and even fan-made restorations of the lost game itself. While Capcom may have buried 1.5, its impact on survival horror never truly faded. Despite Capcom scrapping Resident Evil 1.5, the game refused to be forgotten. Over the years, leaked assets and early development footage surfaced online, giving fans glimpses of what could have been. Then, in 2013, a playable prototype leaked, finally allowing players to experience this lost chapter, though, expectedly, it was incomplete, riddled with missing animations and full of bugs. Since then, modders have worked to restore and rebuild the game using leaked assets and development notes to piece together a more complete version. Some projects aim to stay true to Capcom's original vision, while others attempt to refine 1.5 into something more polished. Capcom themselves have never officially recognised these fan efforts, but they also haven't tried to shut them down either. Perhaps an unspoken acknowledgement that 1.5 remains an undeniable part of Resident Evil history. Capcom have occasionally referenced it in interviews and included small nods as mentioned in later games, but they've never shown interest in officially reviving or remastering it. With playable builds proving that 1.5 could have been a compelling survival horror experience in its own right, some argue that Capcom should embrace its history and release it as a lost chapter of the franchise. However, given the massive success of Resident Evil 2 as we know it, it's unlikely that Capcom will ever revisit the abandoned project in an official capacity. So where does this leave us today? Well, Resident Evil 1.5 certainly had potential. It was darker, more grounded, and leaned further into pure survival horror. But would it have lived up to the expectations set by the first game? If I'm honest, probably not to the same degree that the released second game did. Effectively, by scrapping 1.5 and starting over, Capcom created one of the most beloved horror games of all time. The iconic gothic police station, the terrifying lickers, and the more cinematic storytelling helped Resident Evil 2 redefine the survival horror genre. But had they stuck with 1.5, would it have been an underrated cult classic, or was it doomed from the start? Let me know what you think in the comment section. Should Capcom have finished Resident Evil 1.5, or did it make the right decision to start over? Anyway, if you enjoyed this deep dive into Resident Evil 1.5 and want to play some of the best survival horror games for next to nothing, don't forget to check out the huge discounts on Instant Gaming. You can grab classics like Resident Evil 2 Remake, Resident Evil 7, The Evil Within, and Alien Isolation, all for under $10. So follow my links and build your horror collection for a fraction of the price. Or if you want to support what I do in a more personal way, you can check out my Patreon, where you'll get access to my cosplay library, exclusive content and more. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.